All right. Hi, Lillian Cunningham of the Washington Post. Thank you for joining us so much for this Constitution Day here at OTC.
It's so great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, man, I've been tracking you down for a while and really enjoyed the great work you've done on this podcast and look forward to, I know you're working on a new one now, so looking forward to what you're working on now. With me is Hunter Clouse. Hello. And Celeste Erwin. These are two members of Politically Active, and we all wanted to talk to you a bit about the great work you've done. So Let me ask you about that. What caused you to create this podcast and tell these stories?
Sure. Well, I've been at the Washington Post about 8 years now. And before I did the constitutional podcast, the very first podcast I did for the Post was a podcast called Presidential. And I did that one in 2016 in the election year. And the idea behind that was to, go back and study every single American president. I did it over the course of 44 weeks. And it was sort of a study in presidential leadership and also the evolution of the office of the presidency. And at the time when I did that, I thought it was just this sort of one-off project. I had been a print reporter and thought I would go back to doing that, but I enjoyed podcasting as a medium so much, and a lot of listeners to that podcast sort of recommended that I keep doing it and threw out ideas for another series. And one of the ideas that they threw out was to do something sort of like I had done for Presidential, but for the Constitution, and kind of go back through and chart the people, the figures, the big fights, the sort of important moments in the story of the Constitution. So that idea sounded like exciting and challenging and intriguing enough to me that I dedicated the next year of my life to doing that one.
Lillian, as you know, there are lots of podcasts about the Constitution, many of them really good. But really what sets yours apart from the others, in my opinion, is the vividness with which you describe the swirling passions and the humanity that have created and continue to shape the Constitution. Tell us why you choose to emphasize the humanity in these stories and the drama in these stories as much as you do, rather than some of the more dry legal wrangling.
Right. Well, first, thank you. That's so kind, and I'm so glad if it achieved that for you. And, I think we do have a tendency to see the Constitution as something that's dusty and dry. It's, a governing document that's a set of rules and procedures. But the fact is that it's the roadmap for what we want to be as a nation and who, we as citizens can be as part of this nation. And so I think, it's anything but dry and dusty, and the best way to get at really the spirit of what the document is about is to focus on people. Certainly it's one thing to put in the Declaration of Independence that, our values are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But to me, the Constitution is all about sort of wrestling with, well, how do we live that? And that's where I think all of these really exciting and important stories about people come in, because we tend to think of the Constitution as a document that was written by, the founders and constitutional framers 230 plus years ago. But it's a document that's alive, that so many people in the past 200 plus years have contributed to. They've either, fought for amendments, or they've brought cases before the courts that change our understanding of words that were written into that document, centuries ago. So to me, the best way to bring it to life and actually to just show that it is a living document is to focus on all of those people who've touched it and shaped it in some way. So I'm glad that I'm glad that the podcast felt like it carried that sort of humanity and sort of personal sort of drama with it?
It felt to me like a drama podcast, and it just happened to be about the Constitution. And there's so many, like you say, you like to tell stories about these very fascinating people, and there are just too many great stories to recount in this interview. But I would argue the best one, in my opinion, is the one you end up telling about an individual named Standing Bear as he was fighting literally for his humanity in the court system. So what led you to that story, and how deeply did this story affect you?
I would say that probably is the story that has stuck with me most. But what's amazing about it is it's a story I didn't know at all until I started doing research for the podcast. And for anyone watching this who hasn't listened to that episode, Standing Bear was the chief of a Ponca tribe during the late 1800s, and he and his tribe are forced onto sort of a military government-run reservation, and his son dies in one of the camps, and he sets out with his son's body to bury it in their ancestral homeland. And he gets arrested in the process, and this question goes before a judge, which is basically should Native Americans be treated as human beings under the U.S. Constitution? And it's kind of mind-blowing to think that could even be a question put before the court, but it gives us some indication of how many questions the Constitution did not sort of answer at its beginning. And that story, it's one of, I think there are a lot of powerful stories in the podcast, but to me that was not just a powerful story, but it was also powerful in that it's remarkable so few of us know that story. And the way I came across it actually is, which shows a little bit of my process, I guess, for creating the podcast, is, I do a ton of research and reading, but then I also talk to, as many experts as I can, and I ask everyone's recommendation I can for, what I should read next or what I should study up on. And so that was a story that had been flagged for me by an editor here actually at the Post who spent time in Nebraska, and she knew a scholar who had studied Standing Bear's story. And so it was sort of a circuitous path to it. But as soon as I started reading about his tale, I felt like it had to make its way into the podcast. I wanted the podcast to, be a mix of stories that we're somewhat familiar with, like women's suffrage is one that we talked about, but that I think more people sort of know a bit better. And then stories like this one that are hidden and really need to be surfaced.
I have a question. Have we as a nation kept the moral values our founding fathers have placed within us? I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
I feel like that's the question that's kind of at the very heart of our country and this ongoing experiment that is American democracy. And, I think for us today, but also in every era, we've had to sort of answer that question for ourselves of like, are we living out these constitutional values? And so, the values of promoting the general welfare, or striving toward a more perfect union, or being a country with justice. And I guess my answer would be probably similar to many people's answers, which is that, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. We're not a perfect union. And for every story I came across where it seems like we moved closer to being that perfect union, there are stories I came across that felt like, we took steps backward. So I think the trick really is just that kind of every person has a different answer for themselves about what progress toward that more perfect union looks like, and we're not there yet. We probably will never be there. But that's sort of what we as engaged citizens have to participate in, is asking ourselves, what would it look like for us to better live out those ideals? And everyone has a different answer to what that looks like, which is why we have debate and discussion in this country about how we move forward.
Thank you.
My question's kind of long. So in the podcast Fair Punishment, a comment was made about the Mississippi Delta being the darkest corner of the South with the most racial violence and the hardest state to integrate. And then one of the ones that kind of stuck out to me was that looking at Mississippi as the epitome of the racism and brutality against African Americans. Personally, I have always considered that place to be Alabama, specifically the area surrounding Birmingham, otherwise known as Birmingham. So what kind of led you to the conclusion that the Mississippi Delta was that place that was the center of the racial tension and violence?
Wow, yeah. So that episode, just if people need a little background, that episode was one in which I explored the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, and specifically told the story of this penitentiary in Mississippi called Parchman Farm, and some of the punishments that were doled out to prisoners there. And I don't know that I can say whether Alabama or Mississippi is sort of a better symbol for racial violence and unrest in this country, but unfortunately I think there are a lot of places that at different moments in the country's history have told that story horribly well. But I did find that the people that I spoke to for that Parchman Farm episode, I think sort of the point that they were making was not that, it was less about the point that Mississippi is sort of the worst place in America, or was at that point, and it was more just about how this story about the treatment of prisoners there kind of stood in for many places. I mean, there were prisons in Louisiana too that are known for having the same sort of brutal practices as in Mississippi. But what I tried to do was to find just an example to sort of zero in on that helped tell a story that unfortunately in many of these cases actually is representative of similar stories that have played out in different parts of the country at different points in our history. I don't know if that helps answer it.
That makes a lot more sense.
So I know each of these episodes you poured a lot of effort into. It's got to be impossible for you to choose any one to stand out in your mind, but Lillian, if you had to pick one, which one provided you a revelation or a moment or just a little something extra that you feel you'll carry with you for the rest of your life? I know we've already spoken about Standing Bear.
Yeah, well, I mean, probably two of the ones that would have come to mind first are two that were just mentioned, the Standing Bear episode and the Parchman Farm episode. And I don't know what it says about me, but I guess what those have in common is that they're both pretty heart-wrenching stories that I think that will just stay with me in a really sort of visceral, emotional way for a long time. And stories that I think inspire us to hopefully be a better nation if we understand those parts of our history. But the other thing that I would say that I haven't mentioned yet, but that stands out to me as kind of a memory from the podcast that will stick with me, was just the opportunity to interview Congressman John Lewis. And I spoke to him for the civil rights episode that I did. And it's a privilege of being a journalist in, a newsroom like you see behind me, the Washington Post, where I get to talk to, these people who are such integral parts of shaping the country's history. And, I get to live in Washington, D.C. and be right down kind of the street from the Capitol building. And so to be able to sit in the office with someone like Congressman Lewis, who's, played such an important role in shaping the country's progress on racial equality, that's the kind of privilege and opportunity that, I think I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, just the chance that I had to talk to someone like that.
He's living history.
Yeah.
You talked to a couple people that are living history. One of my favorite stories about the Constitution, I was so happy you told us about the 27th Amendment, and a guy who took a political science class and took it upon himself to change his grade in the most elaborate way possible. Do you want to take a moment to talk about that? It's literally my favorite story about
Sure. That one, that I feel like is just a purely uplifting, great story from the podcast and, well, from our country's history. But that is the story of this guy, how you said, Gregory Watson. He was a student at the University of Texas. And in doing research for one of his college classes, he came across the fact that, way back at the writing of the Constitution, shortly thereafter, that Madison had proposed 2 amendments that didn't end up making it into the Bill of Rights. And one of those essentially said that Congress shouldn't be able to give itself like an automatic pay raise. And it had passed in Congress, but it never got enough state ratifications to actually make it into the Constitution. So this constitutional amendment was kind of out there in like a constitutional purgatory, where in theory, and it turned out ultimately in practice, if enough states ratified it, 200 plus years later, it could actually be part of the Constitution. And so this young guy in college not only, wrote the paper about this, but then set out on this personal mission to get the remaining number of states to ratify this constitutional amendment. And he wrote to, and this is before really the internet, it was in the 80s, and he wrote to state legislatures, he urged congressmen to support it, and this like kind of grassroots campaign he started worked, and by the early 90s it was ratified, and it's the most recently ratified constitutional amendment that we have. And it was just this wonderful story about the power of a kind of quote unquote everyday citizen to shape this foundational document.
I don't remember if you mentioned it in your podcast, but NPR did a story on
Watson.
Yes, and he got his grade changed.
Yes.
The part of it was he got a bad grade and then he got it upgraded to an A. All he had to do was add the amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah. No, I left that detail out, that he didn't get a good grade on the paper and was like so enraged by that. It partly fueled his mission. So,
right, I have
a good message to students. Yeah.
Do you think a time will come when making amendments just isn't good enough? Like when we might just need to make a whole new system altogether?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the scheme of things, we have not had many constitutional amendments. We have 27 of them. 10 of them were the Bill of Rights and passed all at once, and at the nation's beginning. And I talk about this a little bit at the very end of the podcast, but we've had 11,000 proposed amendments. So it gives you the sense of like what a teensy tiny chance that a proposed amendment has of getting through the system. And from everyone I spoke to who's like a constitutional expert, the consensus is that it's getting harder and harder to get an amendment passed. Political polarization is making it hard for kind of anything to happen in Washington, but particularly something on the level of a constitutional amendment. But I guess I would say, in some ways that's by design. The framers didn't want the country to be able to alter the Constitution unless there was, a really strong consensus among, a real majority of people in the country that change should be made. So in a way, the fact that it feels so hard to get it through is kind of the point. I do think that another thing that we've sort of learned over time, though, is that the constitutional amendment process is reserved sort of for things on the magnitude of like equal voting rights, and that for the majority of things, what we really look to the courts to sort of further our constitutional understanding. And so that in a way, the fact that the amendment process is difficult hasn't precluded us from being able to sort of progress and adopt kind of updated, more relevant values as a country, because we turn to the courts to just reinterpret kind of the essence and the spirit of what's already in there. And that, we've definitely seen that evolves over time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know that, I know there are some people out there who talk about, sort of the desire to start from scratch, have another call a constitutional convention, which technically can be done, and maybe change the Constitution in a more dramatic way that would allow for, a different process than the process we have now for amending it. But I think it would take so much for that to happen that the more realistic path forward is probably just that we see more and more cases go to the Supreme Court rather than attempt an amendment process to begin with.
Thank you.
Do you think the prohibition was a good constitutional experiment?
Well, I mean, I think it was not a good experiment in that it failed, but I do actually think, I mean, it was a good experiment, I guess, in that we learned something from it. I think going through that chapter of our history brought some clarity about, what should and shouldn't be an amendment. And I think part of what we found was that, the majority of amendments that we have really fall into two categories. They're either amendments that expand individual liberties, or they are amendments that kind of seek at least to better our government processes, so something like direct election of senators. And prohibition, by definition, didn't fall into either of those two categories. It was a restriction on individual liberty. And so I think what we learned from that experiment is that doesn't seem to work as well as a constitutional amendment, that the place for those sort of restrictions may be, federal law enforcement, state laws that should be passed. But, we wouldn't necessarily have known that if we didn't go through that experiment of having prohibition and realizing all of the kind of unanticipated consequences of putting something like that into the foundational framework for the country.
So many students take my political science 101 class. You have many take them across the country. And as they walk into these 101 classes, it's very common for them to think the Constitution is this static, dusty, dry document written dispassionately and written by like moral, like morally infallible geniuses of great virtue.
Right.
What would be your pitch to those people?
Well, I guess I would start by saying the men who wrote it certainly weren't infallible. Some weren't even necessarily of great virtue. So, I mean, I'd offer a couple of things. And one is that, you know, the Constitution isn't just the result of their efforts. And I don't mean to play down how important the Constitutional Convention was, but I do think sometimes we do lose sight of the fact that the Constitution also reflects the effort of so many other citizens throughout our nation's history. And all of those people, you know, played a role in making it a better document. And to the constitutional framers' credit, that was sort of their intent. You know, they designed a document that could be amended. They designed a document to be elastic. And I think that I think that's the sort of important part, and the part that we should commend more than that they had all of the answers and that they kind of had this moral high ground. It's more just that they had the insight and in some ways the humility to realize that they probably didn't have all the answers. And so I guess I would say to students as well that, you know, this is about the least dusty and dry thing you could study. It's, you know, you look around you today, certainly I sit in this newsroom, and every single thing that we talk about today ultimately involves the Constitution. You know, you see stories about immigration, about privacy online, gun control, women's rights, you know, all of these things that are constantly part of our dynamic, interesting, important conversations as human beings are constitutional questions. And the rights we have because of the Constitution. The rights we want, you know, the only way to get them is to sort of think about whether they are possible under the Constitution. So I remember the very first interview I did for the podcast was with Jeffrey Rosen, who's a constitutional scholar and the head of the National Constitution Center.
And runs a really, really good Constitution podcast himself.
Yeah, called We the People. And just a brilliant guy. And one of the very first things I remember him saying to me in the very first interview I did for the podcast was, like, there is nothing dusty about the Constitution. Like, this is the most exciting thing you could study. And I guess I would turn around and say that back. I'll evangelize that point, you know, that studying the Constitution and understanding the Constitution is the best way to be an engaged citizen, and is kind of the only way to help make the country better in whatever way you think the country needs to be better. So there are a ton of things that are kind of, you know, part of history and can sit there on the shelf, but the Constitution is not one of them. The Constitution is alive.
Now, after we let you go here in just a couple minutes, I'm going to quote this wonderful soliloquy you had at the end of your final episode. And at the end of your final episode, you make this fascinating insight. The one thing that really connects every person in this country, not that we're all crazy different people, but there's one thing that connects us, it's the Constitution. Can you expound just a little bit on that thought?
Yeah, it's actually nice hearing you say that back to me, because I haven't listened back to any of my episodes since I made them. And you hear something like that, and I had a little moment of like, oh yeah, I did write that.
I was very wise.
But I think it's true that, you know, that is the glue in this country. I mean, we forget sort of how improbable it was at the time to set out to create this democracy and this country that, you know, even then it felt like this ambitious undertaking to sort of bring together all these various geographies and backgrounds and colonies. And now think about how much bigger and more diverse America is today than it was back then even. And I think, we don't have the history of many other countries. Like 230-ish years is a really short time in the scheme of things for a country to be around. And we don't all share, a heritage that goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in the same place, sharing the same cultural similarities. It's a country built on difference. And so, yeah, being part of this experiment is what binds us. And the Constitution is that experiment. And I don't know, I guess I can't say it better than I said it myself.